An argument from authority, also called an appeal to authority, is a logical fallacy that argues that a position is true or more likely to be true because an authority or authorities agree with it. Carl Sagan wrote of arguments from authority, "One of the great commandments of science is mistrust arguments from authority." Too many such arguments have proved too painfully wrong. Authorities must prove the contentions like everybody else. Historically, opinion on the appeal to authority has been divided. It has been held to be a valid argument about as often as it has been considered an outright fallacy. John Locke, in his 1690 essay concerning human understanding, was the first to identify argumentum ad verecundium as a specific category of argument. Although he did not call this type of argument a fallacy, he did note that it can be misused by taking advantage of the respect and submission of the reader or listener to persuade them to accept the conclusion. Over time, logic textbooks started to adopt and change Locke's original terminology to refer more specifically to fallacious uses of the argument from authority. By the mid-20th century, it was common for logic textbooks to refer to the fallacy of appealing to authority, even while noting that this method of argument is not always strictly fallacious. In the Western rationalistic tradition and in early modern philosophy, appealing to authority was generally considered a logical fallacy. More recently, logic textbooks have shifted to a less blanket approach to these arguments, now often referring to the fallacy as the argument from unqualified authority, or the argument from unreliable authority. However, these are still not the only recognized forms of appeal to authority. For example, a 2012 guidebook on philosophical logic describes appeals to authority not merely as arguments from unqualified or unreliable authority, but as arguments from authority in general. The book states, appeals to authority are not fallacious provided we have good evidence that the authorities have adequate justification for the views, while also stating, nevertheless, appeals to authority are fallacious if they demand uncritical acceptance of the authorities' statements without evidence of the authorities' reliability. Appeal to non-authorities. Fallacious arguments from authority can also be the result of citing a non-authority as an authority. These arguments assume that a person without status or authority is inherently reliable. The appeal to poverty, for example, is the fallacy of thinking a conclusion is more likely to be correct because the one who holds or is presenting it is poor, when an argument holds that a conclusion is likely to be true precisely because the one who holds or is presenting it lacks authority. It is a fallacious appeal to the common man. A common example of the fallacy is appealing to an authority in one subject to pontificate on another, for example citing Albert Einstein as an authority on religion when his expertise was in physics. However, it is also a fallacious ad hominem argument to argue that a person presenting statements lacks authority and thus their arguments do not need to be considered as appeals to a perceived lack of authority. These types of argument are fallacious for much the same reasons as an appeal to authority. Notable examples: inaccurate chromosome number. In 1923, leading American zoologist Theophilus Painter declared, based on poor data and conflicting observations he had made, that humans had 24 pairs of chromosomes. For the 1920s to the 1950s, this continued to be held based on Painter's authority, despite subsequent counts totaling the correct number of 23. Even textbooks with photos clearly showing 23 pairs incorrectly declared the number to be 24 based on the authority of the then consensus of 24 pairs. This seemingly established number created confirmation bias among researchers, and most cytologists, expecting to detect Painter's number, virtually always did so. Painter's influence was so great that many scientists preferred to believe his count over the actual evidence, to the point that textbooks from the time carried photographs showing 23 pairs of chromosomes, and yet the caption would say there were 24. Scientists who obtained the accurate number modified or discarded the data to agree with Painter's count. Psychological basis. An integral part of the appeal to authority is the cognitive bias known as the Asch effect. In repeated and modified instances of the Asch conformity experiments, it was found that high-status individuals create a stronger likelihood of a subject agreeing with an obviously false conclusion, despite the subject normally being able to clearly see that the answer was incorrect. Further, humans have been shown to feel strong emotional pressure to conform to authorities and majority positions. A repeat of the experiments by another group of researchers found that participants reported considerable distress under the group pressure, with 59% conforming at least once and agreeing with the clearly incorrect answer, whereas the incorrect answer was much more rarely given when no such pressures were present. Scholars have noted that the academic environment produces a nearly ideal situation for these processes to take hold, and they can affect entire academic disciplines, giving rise to groupthink. One paper about the philosophy of mathematics, for example, notes that within mathematics, if a person accepts our discipline and goes through 2 or 3 years of graduate study in mathematics, he absorbs our way of thinking, and is no longer the critical outsider he once was. If the student is unable to absorb our way of thinking, we flunk him out, of course. If he gets through our obstacle course and then decides that our arguments are unclear or incorrect, we dismiss him as a crank, crackpot, or misfit.